I'd like to start with a question about Brexit. So the rest of Europe has been watching with dread what has been happening in Britain for the last months. What do you think will be the most likely scenario? How will all this end?
Well, the dread with which you watch what's happening is nothing compared to the dread with which we watch what is happening. And I still think that it's possible we will not leave in the end. I think that it may be the only way to get through this deal, which seems to be now nearly agreed through Parliament, will be if it's attached with the promise of a second referendum on the deal. And as this deal will not be as good as what we have at the moment, if there are only two options on the ballot paper, maybe we will then vote after everything then to stay and reject this deal. But I think that the damage has been huge. We've suffered extraordinary loss of international prestige, and we've suffered huge political polarization at home. And this issue that basically nobody cared about only 5 years ago has now divided us worse than we've been divided in my lifetime or in my parents' lifetime.
So what do you think are the lessons to be learned from this situation?
I think one lesson is that mixing direct democracy and representative democracy is not a good idea, and we have a parliamentary system. And what we should have said is that if you want Britain to leave the European Union, then form a political party and win an election on that manifesto, and then you can do it. But the idea that a referendum is gives a simple answer, a simple, powerful answer, is a very dangerous one, because the answer is simple, but the question is very complicated. And it was never really clear on the ballot paper or during the campaign what kind of Brexit we wanted. Was this going to be the very soft Brexit that was promised publicly by the Brexiters? Was it going to be the very hard, radical Brexit that they talked about to their supporters, or something in between? We don't know. And the referendum result didn't give us that. I think if we'd had better political leadership, and that's the second thing, that our political class, I think, is kind of exhausted and discredited. But if David Cameron or Theresa May, straight after the referendum, had said, right, it's a narrow result, it's not going to be a very hard Brexit, it'll be a soft one, we're going to be like Norway, we could have joined the European Economic Area and have been out of the EU within 6 months. And nobody would notice and nobody would care, and it would already be 2 years ago, and we would have got a deal which in some respects was Norway plus, in some respects was Norway minus, but it would be very boring and basically satisfactory. So we could have done that, and nobody stopped us doing it except our own political weakness at the top.
In the meanwhile, in Ukraine, we had a change of government, another president. Our new president Zelensky is promising to bring peace. He basically made it a cornerstone of his agenda, and he seems on the way to meeting Vladimir Putin again, and Angela Merkel and President of France Emmanuel Macron in the Normandy 4 summit. What do you think are the risks? What should he beware of? Or do you expect there will be a significant pressure on him, and maybe the European allies also in a way standing by Russian agenda?
I think there are risks. I think one risk is that Ukraine is pushed by the West into making a bad deal. I think there's also a danger that Ukraine is pushed by Ukraine into making a bad deal. And the big thing for me is not so much what are the terms of the, say we have a ceasefire in the east, maybe the question of Crimea is postponed for a decade or longer. These are all reasonable potential political compromises, and it's up to Ukrainians if they want them. The question is, what does Russia do next? And my worry is that Russia's long-term interest is in destabilizing Ukraine, and that the eastern territories will be used as a continual kind of wound, an economic and political irritant for Ukraine, and that Russia's interests here are not sincere. So I worry about that. But I think I'm against outsiders telling Ukraine to be tough, because I think Ukraine has been tough and the outsiders didn't help. And we are in no position to advise you to take more casualties and more suffering and more economic losses when we didn't help you. It is fundamentally a question for Ukraine to decide, and the Ukrainian president has a huge mandate, and that's the thing about democracy. You elect leaders and they do things.
Ukraine now has also been against its own will in the center of the political scandal, political storm in the United States. Do you think that might have an impact on the US support, on the US bipartisan support to Ukraine? There are some fears in Ukraine that it might be the case.
I think this is an absolute nightmare, because whatever you do, you offend someone very important. So if you cooperate with President Trump, you infuriate the Democrats, and you need the Democrats both in the future because they might be in government, and right now because Congress votes the money through for you. But if you annoy President Trump, well, he's the guy in charge. So it's a lose-lose situation, and I feel very sorry for Ukraine that you're in this. And I'm not sure you could have done anything differently. I don't think this wasn't Ukraine's fault. There's no point where you can say, well, that was a big mistake. You just got sucked into this.
What do you think Ukraine should do at this point? So it should just wait till the 2020 elections in the US with its fingers crossed?
I would suggest that you rename the NATO Operations Conference Center near Odessa as Fort Trump, and try and attract President Trump's attention with some bright, shiny thing that he will like, or rename the main...
You know, there is a cafe already somewhere in Ukraine called Trump.
Yes. Now, I would rename the road from the Borispol airport to Kiev Trump Highway. And you have to try and play this game and just do something that will make him, will attract his attention in a positive way, but that doesn't damage your standing with the Democrats.
So these small measures you think might help?
I'm being slightly flippant, but I think it's really difficult. I think that there are serious questions about Hunter Biden's involvement and the Burisma generally, and Mr. Zlochevsky, and all these things are, and one could, if one wanted to be critical, one could say that this is the problem with running a corrupt political and economic system, is that it doesn't just damage you, it gives outsiders ways of attacking you as well. And if, it's a big if, but if this had never happened with the gas licenses and Burisma and so on, then Ukraine would not be so open to criticism. So I think there are things that are worth investigating here, but they are not things that President Trump should be using as part of his political fight against Joe Biden, who's still his likely rival in the presidential election. So I'm afraid I can offer you only sympathy, but not advice on this.
But do you think Ukraine can still count on the US support, or there will be less support? The US will want to stay away from Ukraine and distance itself, and maybe also in a Ukrainian fight against Russian aggression?
I think it's going to be difficult. I don't think people are queuing up to replace Kurt Volker or to be the new ambassador to Ukraine. And Ukraine is now sort of toxic in the American political context. So I think that the key thing is to concentrate on practical. President Zelensky has a good reform agenda. I'd concentrate on making sure the IMF is happy, dealing with the Privatbank problem, making sure that all the other multilateral and other governmental partners are satisfied, and try and broaden your appeal and be prepared for less interest in the United States.
Russia's President Putin is probably happy with this situation.
I think he's probably popping open the Champanskoye in the Kremlin every night, except he doesn't drink. But he's. This is very good for. Zelensky's victory was very bad for Russia, because it showed that you could have a free and fair election, which a political outsider can come in and overturn an incumbent. This is not something that would happen in Russia. The Rada elections were also a kind of election that Russians could only dream of. That would never happen in the Duma. So the difference between Ukraine's open political system and Russia's closed one was really underlined. And I'm afraid that a lot of those gains have been undermined by this controversy over Hunter Biden and the prosecutor and all these issues that are really not of Ukraine's making. The
US has been withdrawing from Syria and basically left the Kurds, who are part of the anti-ISIS alliance alone. So now the allies of the United States and other parts of the world, like Ukraine, are asking themselves, like, will the same fate one day meet them as well? Like, why? What consequences will that have? And do the US allies really have a reason to be worried?
Well, I think that, I mean, it is very bad, and this is, I think, the third or possibly the fourth time that that the United States has betrayed the Kurds. It's becoming a kind of habit, and it's terrible. I think that it's not a direct analogy because the YPG is closely aligned to the PKK, which is not like a typical American ally. You don't have, in the other NATO allies, you don't have militias operating as terrorist groups carrying out operations inside neighbouring countries. And I mean, I'm certainly not sympathetic to the Turkish government on this, and I think that they've created the Kurdish problem by their very repressive policies. But I think that one could argue that the YPG relied rather too much on the American support, and perhaps what they should have done was to use the period of American backing to try and reset the negotiations with Turkey. It would have been very difficult. Erdogan is not an easy man to deal with. But I think there was perhaps a little bit of a complacency on the Kurds. They thought, well, the Americans need us, so we can carry on with our extremely hardline approach to Turkey. And maybe they could have, maybe there was some, in retrospect, they should have handled that a bit differently. But I don't think it's a direct analogy with, say, Latvia, because Latvia is not is a state, and the YPG was a militia.
And I have a question about Georgia as well. The former NATO Secretary General Rasmussen said that there might be an option of Georgia being accepted as a NATO member to NATO if the Article 5 does not function on the territory that is currently occupied by Russia. Do you think this scenario is realistic, and might it in the future be realistic for Ukraine as well?
I think that the prospect of getting Ukraine and Georgia into NATO in any circumstances is good. I mean, it is to be welcomed. I think that the question of territorial integrity is something that is what we pay diplomats to deal with. West Germany didn't recognize East Germany at the time that West Germany joined NATO, but we accepted West Germany as a founder member of NATO at a time when the eastern or Soviet zone of Germany was a country that no Western country recognized at the time. So there's room for creative ambiguity on that. I'd also point out that Article 5 is much less definitive than people think. It says that NATO members, collectively or individually, will respond, but it doesn't give a sort of unconditional guarantee. So there's plenty of room for manoeuvre on that. I think it's really important to try and get Georgia into all Western security structures as quickly as possible, because Georgia is slipping away. We see more Russian influence, we see growing Chinese influence, we see political polarization, we see the degradation of public institutions, violent confrontations at international conference. We never saw that before. So I really worry that Georgia is in a kind of vacuum, and because it's a small country, it doesn't have the critical mass to keep going. I think Ukraine, as a big country, has a tremendous internal momentum, and foreign help is nice, but you can actually do it on your own. Georgia, at sort of under 5 million people, really needs outside support, and it's not getting it at the moment, not getting it from Germany, not getting it from the EU, not getting it from the United States, not getting it from anyone.
So what should change for it to get it?
Well, I hope Secretary General Rasmussen is right on this. I have to say I'm a little bit sceptical, but I think that we need, I do hope things will change once we have the new European Commission in, and a new German leader, Mrs. Kramp-Karrenberg, I've got her name wrong, AKK, who was here at the Riga Conference today. When she gets her feet, if she gets her feet under Mrs. Merkel's desk, we may see a more sort of energetic European diplomacy, and it may be that we get something coming up at the next NATO summit where they want to have a success. So hope springs eternal. But I have to say, I'm not optimistic at the moment. I think we are in a period of great dislocation in the West, both internal, in terms of our internal cohesion and in terms of cohesion between countries. And this is it's a bad time to be a small country that is on the outside and needs support and attention.
And in the EU, do you think the EU foreign policy will change? Will there be more emphasis on the Eastern neighborhood now with the new European Commission and the new High Representative Josep Borrell?
I'm a bit sceptical because I think that the Eastern Partnership wasn't really a good idea in the beginning. It was a question, and we couldn't really. I could never find out so there was an answer, and I could never really find out what is the question to which the Eastern Partnership is an answer, except we have to do something. And the 6 countries were radically different in size and in orientation. It didn't really make sense to me to lump them all together. So I'm a skeptic on that. What I want to see is the new EU-Ukraine agreement being exploited to the full. There's plenty more to do on that. I want to see trade booming and more, everything from educational exchanges to infrastructure. There's a whole load of things that can be done to strengthen the EU-Ukrainian relationship. So that's very important. The thing that encourages me with the EU, I think, is more that the new Commission looks as though it might be a bit tougher on China. The new foreign policy concept for the EU actually explicitly labels China as a strategic rival. That's new. And I think that, although for Ukraine, Russia's the big problem, for the world, China's the big problem. And I get the impression the EU is beginning to realize what a difficult adversary, not just rival, it faces in China. And the more that China tries to control what happens outside China, particularly on things like what happens in universities and what companies do and so on, I think the more Europeans start getting worried. So I think my guess is that we'll see pretty much continuity in the Russia policy, but we may see a much sharper edge to the China policy.